On this video, I'm going to show you the basics of how to use Firebase with a Vue.js app. We're going to create a login page, and then we're going to authenticate with Firebase. That will give us access to Firestore, Firebase storage, and all sorts of other great features. Now, if you're a fan of React, hang tight because I do have some React videos coming up very soon. But I personally believe that I had a relatively big breakthrough after learning a JavaScript framework and then learning authentication, in this case, Firebase. So if you learn how to create an authentication layer with Firebase, it's going to come a very long way into helping you build anything that you want to build online. If you want to follow along, you're going to need the Vue CLI, which you can get at cli.vuejs.org, and you're going to need the Firebase CLI. You're also going to need a Firebase account. It's going to be a free account. None of this is going to cost any money, but make sure that you have a Firebase account and then a Firebase CLI and the Vue CLI. The Firebase CLI can be found at firebase.google.com/docs/CLI. Once you have the CLIs installed, navigate to your terminal and create a folder where you want your project to be. For me, this is in my home folder, and then I have /dev/Firebase login. Now, the Vue CLI is going to create another folder inside of Firebase login for me. In order to do this, we're going to type Vue create and then our app name. In this case, I'm going to name it Firebase login. Now it's going to ask us which features and version that we want. We're going to use Vue 2 right now just because Vue 3 does not have the dev tools ready in order to manage Vuex, and Vuex is going to be part of this. So for the time being, let's go to manually select features. We'll keep Babel. We'll leave TypeScript out of this one. It's not going to be a progressive web app. We are going to want the router. We're going to want Vuex. And then we can leave the linter formatter, and those will be the settings. And then we're going to choose Vue 2. And we want this to be in history mode. So history mode, yes. And I'm going to do ESLint with error prevention only. You can use any of these that you want if there's something that you prefer. Maybe you like ESLint with Prettier. I prefer to use Prettier from inside VS Code. So I'm going to just do ESLint with error prevention only. And we will do lint on save, that's fine. I like to put everything in package.json when I can. And I'm not going to save this as a preset. So we'll give that a second to install. Now that it's done installing, I'll open up the folder just so we can see what we have here. And it's created a new Firebase login folder. And then we have our project here. So let's open this up in VS Code. I'm going to cd into this new folder and then open it up in code. And to get started, we'll open up the terminal, which can be done with Control and then the tilde button. And we'll do npm run serve. And this will spin up our development server. Once this is up, you can hold Control or Command and then click on this, and that should open up your Vue app right there. Ordinarily, I like to use Vuetify, and recently I've started enjoying working with Quasar, but for now we're going to add a little bit of styling with something called Water CSS. That's because it's a classless CSS system, which I think is just incredibly cool. So if you Google search that, it'll bring you to this page. You can choose if you want the automatic theme, the dark theme, or the light theme. I'm going to choose just the dark theme because we don't know what settings people are going to have on their computer. We can copy this link right here, and then we're going to have to paste that into the source folder. I'm sorry, the public folder, and then index.html. So let's put that right above the ending head tag. And that will give us some nice styling by default. If we take a look at our app again, it doesn't look great because the Vue CLI bootstraps a little bit of styling, but we're going to delete that. So it's going to leave us with a nice starting point. We're going to go to the app.vue file, and we're going to change a few things here. The first thing that we're going to change is the color in this app ID tag. Let's just change that to white. And then the anchor tag here, again under nav, we're going to make this light blue. And the active tab, we're going to change this to slate blue. So let's take a look and see how that looks. I think this looks a little bit better with this theme. I'm not a great designer. This is probably not professional quality standards, but I think this looks a lot better than it did a moment ago. In case you're new to Vue Router, the way that this works, this router view tag right here, this serves almost as like a window into the components or views that the router is pointing to. So these are links. These are going to look just like anchor tags. And if we take a look at that, this is what it's referencing. These are the router links. And then the stuff in the middle that's changing, this is the stuff that's peering through this router view window right here. So let's take a look at the actual router and see how that works. Under router and then index.js, we have the home page, which is being loaded, and then we have the about page, which is being loaded. The about page is being lazy loaded, so you see that it only loads, it only imports when you actually click on it, whereas the home page is preloaded. We set this to history mode, and that prevents us from having this in the URL. The hash symbol, the reason we don't have that is because we're in history mode. So the Vue router really isn't too complicated. In order to use it, we only have to import a component that we want to view when that route is active. Now, we have this views folder on the left, and then we have this components folder. These are going to be exactly the same. The only difference is the name of the folder for organizational purposes. So you can tell that the way that the Vue CLI is trying to bootstrap the app, they want us to use the views folder anytime that we have a view that we want to show, which is simple enough, right? But if you ever wanted to create a view out of the components folder, you absolutely can do that. It doesn't matter what folder it's in, as long as it's a .vue file at the end of the day. So let's change this just a little bit. Let's change the about page to a status page. So this will say status. We'll change the name to status with a capital S. And then let's get rid of the lazy loading right here, and let's just add the component the same way the above component is added. Now we don't actually have a status component yet, so let's create that. And again, that's going to be a page. So let's delete the about page because we're not going to need that. And we can also delete this hello world.view component because we're going to completely replace that. And now in the views folder, we'll do new file. We'll name this status.view. I have a plugin. I don't recall the name right now, but I can type in vbase CSS and it will bootstrap a Vue Options API style component, a single page component, single file component rather. So if you don't have that available, I believe the plugin is by Sarah Drasner. That's Drasner. If you type her name into the extensions right here, you should be able to find it pretty easily. And I believe this is it right here. I just double checked. It's the Vue VS Code snippets, the one that has this Superman-like image on the front. There's a few things that I like to do. I like to give it a name. So I'm going to call this status, which is going to be spelled with a capital S, just like the actual component name. Let's give this an h2 tag. And we'll say status. And then we'll give it an h3 tag. And it will say, you are not logged in. And then again, as a matter of preference, I always like to create the outermost container with a class name that also matches the component name. So I'm going to give this a class of a class of status with lowercase s this time. Now if we go back to app.view, we now want this to go to status, and we want this to say status. Now unfortunately it's not going to work yet. We have to go to the router, which again is under router and then index, and we need to import the status component. So we'll do import status from, and then we can find it under views. There we go. So now we don't have the red squiggly line anymore, but we still have an error, and that's because we don't have hello world.view. So we need to fix that. If we go to the home.view view, then we can get rid of hello world right there, and we can get rid of the image as well. And instead, let's put an H2 right here, and we will say home, just so we can identify what we're looking at when it loads. We also want to delete where we're importing this, and we want to delete where the component is being registered. And now we should compile again. If we take a look at it, we have home and status, and that's about it. Now let's create our login component. We'll right click on the components folder, new file, and we'll call this login.view. And again, we'll do vbase css, and we'll give this a name, login with a capital L. And again, I'm going to add a class login with a lowercase l. And then let's give this an H2, and we'll name it login, just so we can visually ensure that it shows up. We'll go back to our home view right here, and we're going to import the login component. So let's call the login component right here, just like that. It can be self-closing, and then we're going to have to import it, and we're going to do import login from components/login.view. As you can see right here, we have this comment that says that the @ symbol is an alias to /src. So we're in src/components/login.view. That's exactly where our component is. Now we have to add the component registration here and add login. So anytime you're registering a component, you're going to have it in 3 places. You're going to have it in the template where you want it to show. You're going to have it at the top of the script tag where you're importing it. And then you're going to have it in this exported area within the script tag where it's being registered as a component. So now if we go take a look at it, we see home, and then we see login. And again, we have our status area right there. So everything's working as expected. We're going to add a text input right here. That will be self-closing. And then if we copy that down, we're going to have another one, and this one is going to be password. And now we need 2 different things. We need a sign up and a sign in, or a login. So we're going to have to make 2 separate components here. Or the way that I would prefer to do it so that we don't have to duplicate our code is that we can add some directives in here to identify whether the person is trying to log in or sign up. So let's go ahead and finish creating this as if it's a sign up form. We're going to duplicate the password again, and now we're going to add a button here. The button is going to say sign up. Let's add some placeholders. So for the text field, we'll have the placeholder say email. And then for the input text, the first one, we'll have the placeholder say password. And for this one, we'll say verify password. Or we'll say confirm. Next, we're going to create our data section here. So that's going to look just like a function that returns an object of key value pairs. So this is sort of what it's going to look like. Let's make this first item in here, this first key, we'll make that say view. That's view as in V-I-E-W, because we have two views. We have sign up and sign in. So let's make this say sign up, like that. And that's how we're going to decide which items we're going to show. Better yet, let's use some better practices here. And we will change this to a Boolean. So we'll call this login, because people are only going to sign up once, but they're going to log in plenty of times. So we'll make login the default. We'll call it login view. And then we'll change this to true. Now we can make this text here dynamic. So let's put this inside of double curly braces. And the way that this is going to work is we're going to use a ternary operator. So we're going to reference login view. Essentially, is this person trying to log in? So if the login view is set to true, then we want this to say login. If it's set to false, we want it to say sign up. And we already know how this is going to work, so now I think we can add our methods. And our first method here, let's call it authenticate. And we're going to need two other methods because of the way that this is set up. So first, let's add this to the button. We'll say on click. I'm using the at click to make it a little bit shorter, equals authenticate. Now what it's going to do here is when authenticate is called, based on whether this is true or false, it's going to decide which method it's going to go to next. So it's going to need two more methods. It's going to need sign in and sign up. We'll call it login and sign up. Just like that. And for the time being, let's just give each of these an alert. And they will create an alert with the name of the method. So when authenticate is called, we want an if statement in here. We're going to say if login view. This is the same as saying if login view is true, then we actually need to put a this in front of it because we're referencing this object right here. So if this dot login view, if login view is true, then we're going to call this dot login. If it's false, or we'll just say else, we're going to call this dot sign up. And let's move this alert back to the top here. Okay, so everything looks good now. Now we want to make sure that we wrap this login right here in some sort of unit. So let's create a section and we'll give it a class name of form, even though we're not using the form tag, because then we would have to set the prevent default. So anytime the button is clicked, it doesn't automatically submit. But we have this now wrapped in a section tag with a class of form. And the reason that we did that, if we take a look at it, it's over to the left side. If I zoom out a little bit, you can see it better. So we want this to be centered. In order to do that, in order to get it centered, all we need to do is reference both the login that we created, the login class that we created, and the form class that we created. The login form is the one at the top because it matches the name of the component. And then the form is the one that we just wrapped it in. It's the section tag. So what it's doing is we're setting the display to flex. We're setting the flex wrap to no wrap, although this shouldn't really matter with what we have right now. And then for form, we're setting the margin to auto. That will center it. So if we look at it, it looks better. We can actually get rid of this home tag right there. So let's do that. Let's go to the home page and I'm just gonna comment that out. There we go. It looks a little bit nicer. Maybe we should wrap this with a line with some nice curved edges. So if we go back to login, anytime there's some styling to be done, I'm going to pause the video and not waste your time with that. But what I did here is on the form tag, I added 20 pixels of padding. I added a border that's 2 pixels white and solid, and then a border radius that is 8 rem. Now if we take a look at it, we have this nice white line around it. Again, not a designer, but I think it looks a little bit better than what we had before. One more thing that I'm going to do here is I'm going to add another tag and another class rather. It's going to be called primary so that we can give the button a little bit better styling. So let's give this the class of primary. And let's see how it looks. These are what I used. I used color FFF, which is just white text, and the background color for the button is 275A90. And again, it works. Not the most beautiful thing in the world. Maybe it would look a little bit more appropriate if we change this to light blue so that it matches the link button. That's a little bit too much. I'll undo it for now because I don't want to waste time on styling. Now we don't want to see this password confirm slot right here if we're trying to log in. So let's change this. We'll give it a directive of v if, and we only want it to show if login view is false. So we'll say if exclamation point login view. So there we go. We're on the login view right now, and we only have email and password. That's great. And to add a little bit more spacing right here, I just threw in margin top 20 pixels in this primary slot right there, the primary class. Now we want people to be able to switch between login and sign up. So I'm going to add an anchor tag right underneath the button, and I'll get rid of the href, and instead we'll change this to @click equals, and we'll say toggle view, which we don't have yet. But what we want this to say for the text, we want it to be the same as the button says right here, except we want it to be reversed. So we can just throw an exclamation point in front of login view, and that should work. Let's see if that worked. Now we have sign up. We need to give this a class so we can have a pointer when we hover over it. So let's say class equals toggle, and then we'll create a toggle class, and we'll say cursor pointer. And now if we take a look at it, there we go. We have the correct cursor now. So now what is toggle view going to do? Let's create that method. Toggle view. And this is going to change this variable right here, the login view. So we'll say this.login view equals not this.login view. And that should be all we need. There we go. If we click on it, now we have that toggle. Now that we have that, we can copy the same tag right here, the same text from the button, and let's add that up to the header at the top. And again, when we click this, now it changes to sign up or log in. The button changes, and we have this little area here where we can toggle what we're looking at. So everything's working beautifully. Since we have a form, we're going to need a little bit of validation. So right where the methods end here, we're going to add computed properties. I like to do this, v computed, and it will add in the first sort of property right there. And again, that's part of that package I showed at the beginning where you can use vbase to set up your components. But the first thing that we want here is going to be to make sure that an email address exists, or that there's an email address filled in. So we'll call this email valid. And how are we going to verify if that works? first we need to actually create the email and the password variables, and then we'll work with that. So we'll create the variables here for email. We'll set it to null by default. Password, that will also be null by default. And then we'll say password verify. That's also going to be null by default. So to test if an email address is valid, we might want to do something like this. We'll add an if statement, and the conditions will say if this.email.includes, and we're going to want to check that it includes the @ symbol. And we're also, so we'll do and this.email.includes, it's going to need to have a period, and then this.email.includes, I'm sorry, not includes, .length is greater than, we'll say 5. I'm not sure what the actual minimum is, but we need the and symbols right there. What I'm going to do for good measure to avoid potentially erroring out, I'm going to add a question mark here, which is essentially checking, does the email exist? If it exists, then does it include this? Does it include this? Is the length greater than 5? So that's what we'll set it to check if the email address is valid. Now we're going to return true, because the email is valid if these are true. We'll delete this boilerplate right here, and we always need an else clause with if we're using a computed statement, because the computed statement always needs to have a value. It can't have a value of true when it's true and then no value when it's false. So we'll just say else return false. And that should be good there. Now let's also create a validator for the email address, for the password. So we'll call this password matches. And when we say password matches, we're referring to the password and then the confirmation password. So we'll, just like we did with the email, we'll say if this.password, and then all we need it to say is equals this.password verify. And one more thing, we need to make sure that the length, so we'll say this.password.length is greater than 3. Again, I don't know if we have any specific qualities the password needs to have, but I would hope that it's over 3 characters. But again, the reason we're doing that is because we don't want the password to say it matches while the field is also empty. So we could also say, we can also do this. We can also say that the password is not null. So that probably makes a little bit more sense, and then you could have the length checked differently in a different spot. But since we're doing password matches, we're going to return true. And again, we'll do else return false. So now we have the ability to check if the password matches. Now let's create another one, and we'll say variables complete, or maybe ready to submit. In order to make sure that it's ready to submit, there's going to be 2 different situations. Where there's going to be the scenario where the view is set to, the login view is true, and where the login view is false. So let's say if this.login view, which is again saying if this.login view is true, let's add an else block here underneath it. So if the login view is active, then we only need the email and the password. So we can check that the email is valid. As a matter of fact, let's add another if clause in there. Or better yet, we'll just return this dot email is valid, or email valid, and we need to make sure that there is a password. And we can do that by saying exclamation point, exclamation point. So we're saying password is not null. It looks like I misspelled valid here. And now the else clause. So if we're on the sign up view instead of the login view, we're going to want to check that the password matches and that the email is valid. So I'm going to put that at the beginning again, this.email valid, and the password matches. So let me double check my logic here. And the way that I'm going to do that is I'll take this ready to submit, and we're going to add that to the button as disabled. So in order to recognize this as a method, we need to add a colon right before it. So we're saying it's disabled if ready to submit is false. So let's take a look. Ready to submit is false. We have an email address. We'll say test@.com. All right, so something still isn't right here. So let me double check what that is. And it should be very obvious to anyone who uses Vue what the problem is here. The problem is that we didn't bind our email and password to the form. So we're going to use vModel because it's two-way binding. So on the email, we'll say vModel equals password, email, vModel equals password. And then vModel equals password verify. Now let's try this again. Okay, so that looks correct. The login button turned on as soon as we had the right things there. If we get rid of the period, we lose the login button. If we get rid of the @ symbol, we lose the login. And if we lose the password, okay, that's working as expected. Let's go to sign up. And let's add a password in here. We'll say test. And then we'll try QWER. Nope. Okay, so let's try test. So now something isn't working. We have test in both of these spots and it's not lit up. So did I set a length for that? Okay, so the problem here is I'm missing an exclamation point. The way that the password matches logic is working is it's checking to see if the two passwords match. But again, I wanted to check to see if the password wasn't null, and I set it to and null. So that's the problem. So if we fix that, try this again. Go to sign up, I'm typing test. There we go. So we're good to go. The logic here all works nicely. Now don't panic, but we're jumping into Vuex. Vuex took me a really long time to wrap my head around, but once it clicked really well, and it's been one of the most useful tools I've had since then. So try to not get overwhelmed with Vuex, and I promise you that a good explanation will make it incredibly easy to use. There are a lot of different opinions online about how you should use it, whether or not you should use it. What I'm going to say is that if you're using Vue 3, you might not need it. But the way that it works, it's very standardized. It uses the flux pattern. So it's just like Redux, if you're familiar with that. And it scales incredibly well. So we're going to use it the way that it was very commonly used for Vue 2. Now, if we take a look, we sort of have this bootstrap right here. We have state, mutations, actions, and modules. Since this is a small app, I'm going to delete modules, but what I am going to add in that we don't have here is going to be getters. So I'm going to put that right underneath state. So really quick, let's explain what these do. State is going to be a list of all of the points of state management. So any value that you want managed by the state is going to be here. So for example, we're going to want a user object. We'll just set that to null. And since we're not using TypeScript, we don't really have to specify what it is offhand at the moment. Now for getters, all that getters do is they return the state to us. There's a few reasons why this is cool. The first thing about it is we don't ever have to touch the state directly. We're getting it through a proxy. Getters are those proxies. The other reason that getters are really cool is because you can find different ways to query objects from the state and get back different views or different data points. So although some people don't use getters and they'll go right into state to get the information that they want, I highly recommend using getters. So let's actually add a getter for the state because we want to be able to get the state. Let's call this current user. And we're going to have to pass in the state to it. And now from within here, we can reference the state. So we will say return state.user. So very simply stated, we're giving it access to state by passing state in, and then we're returning state.user. So when you call the current user getter, you're going to get state.user. It's really just that simple. Now actions are exactly what they sound like. Actions are going to be actions that we want to happen. So in this case, we're going to want to set the user. So when you log in, we're going to call the set user action. Now set user is going to have, or any action is going to have curly braces, and then it's going to have commit. So this is where it starts getting a little bit different from the JavaScript that you're used to normally seeing. This commit object right here is what's going to allow you to commit mutations. So without too much explanation, there's not a whole lot that you need to know about it right now, but let's, just for the sake of example, if we were to do commit, we could throw anything in here. So we could do console log. Now, if we call set user right now, it's just going to log hello world to the console. So although this looks complicated, the only thing that's realistically happening here is we're telling it to perform an action. We're telling it to run a method, basically. Now, anytime that we call set user, we're going to have to pass in a user object as well. So after this commit object right here, let's add user. And let's get rid of this commit hello world because it's never actually used like that. That was just an example of what this commit thing here actually does. But what we are going to commit is set user, and that's going to be with an underscore between set and user. It's all going to be capital. This is by convention, so it doesn't have to be this way, but this is the way that people tend to use it. The action is the act of calling the mutation. Again, all we're trying to do is we're trying to make sure that our state is never modified or called directly. So we're creating a proxy between modifying the state and we're creating a proxy between calling the state. So we're going to call set user, which doesn't exist yet. So let's actually add that right now. Set user. And we want to pass state into here. And we're also going to want to pass the user object into there. And then just like we did with the getters here where we returned it, we're going to say state.user equals user. It's basically the exact opposite of what we're doing with these getters right here. So if we take a look here, we're committing set user, and then we just need to pass in user to it. This actually needs to be a string. So I know, again, this is where Vuex is a little bit weird, but when you dispatch an action or when you call a mutation, you're referring to the name of that action or mutation as a string. And let me double check, because I rarely go from memory on this. So I'll make sure that this is correct, and if it's not, I'll make that very clear for you. Let's see if our state works. Let's go to app.view, and above the navigation bar right here, let's add in a variable, and let's call it user. Now, let's actually see if we can access that from state. So we're going to call a script tag. And then we need sort of our boilerplate Vue.js stuff in here, which for starters, we're just going to give it the name of app, just like we have with the rest of these. And now let's add computed. And we want to add user. Now, user is going to return, and now we can call the store a special way right now. If we go into main.js right here, you see that we have the router and the store being passed into the Vue object. It looks very similar with Vue 3, but because it's being passed in here, we can reference it just like this. We can say this dot, and then with a $, store dot getters dot current user. I believe we named it right. Getters current user, and it returns state.user. So now the user variable, which we have up here, should return the value of the state. So let's take a look, and it's null right now. So let's try changing that and see if something shows up. Let's change that to a string that says null. There we go, and it pops up right there. So it seems to be working. Now we just need to check if the actions and the mutations work. Let's change this back to null. And we're going to change the user object after we authenticate with Firebase. We have everything in place to do that right now. So let's go ahead and add it. So I'm going to open a new terminal right here. And let's do this. We're going to build this. We want to create a build folder. If we look at our package.json right here, we can see that there's a script. Let me drag this down a little bit. There's a script right here for build. So all we have to do is call npm run build, and it will build the project, and it will throw it into a build or a dist folder. So npm run build. And we'll give this a second to do its thing. Now, as you can see, it created this dist folder right here. And this is the actual sort of minified and cleaned up version of our app. So now we can add Firebase. If we go to the Firebase dashboard, we'll go to add new project. And I'm going to give this the name of Firebase login. And I don't remember if this is global. Let me move this over a little bit. I don't remember if this is global or if it's from my workspace. It looks like we're good. I'm going to turn off the Google Analytics for this particular app, and I'm going to do create project. Now, it's going to give us some credentials here that we can use. So we'll give this a second to finish setting up, and it redirects us to this page. So now we can click right here to create a web app. And again, I'm going to try calling this Firebase login. And we want hosting for it. Okay, looks good. We're going to do register app. Now it tells us that we want to paste this at the bottom of our body tag. So let's copy that, and let's go back to VS Code. Let's go back to our public folder and index, and then at the bottom of the body tag, We'll paste it in right there. And we may actually not need to do that since we're in the Node.js runtime. This is what you would do if you're using a static website and maybe you're not using Node.js, but it doesn't really hurt to put it in there right now, especially just for the sake of example. And we're going to go ahead and click Next. This is telling us to install Firebase tools. So if you didn't already do that, go ahead and do that. But I believe that the CLI would walk you through that if you already installed it. It tells you to do Firebase login, which I've already done. Once you do it once, you don't have to do it again. And then Firebase init is how you initialize the Firebase project, and then Firebase deploy will push it. So we need to do Firebase init and Firebase deploy. We'll continue to the console. And let's go back to our project now. Let me zoom in for you. All right, let's do Firebase init. Now you have to be careful here because you can override some of the stuff that you've created if you don't do this correctly. We are going to select, you know what, I'm going to add Firestore. I'm not going to do anything with Firestore right now, but I'll make a sequel to this video and I'll get into how Firestore works. We want hosting, and that's it. Now, ordinarily, it's good practice to set up emulators because it's much cheaper to work with emulators when you're using functions or Firestore or the real-time database, anything like that. But for this particular example, we don't have to. So I'm just going to have Firestore and hosting selected. And I'm going to select an existing project because we just created it. It'll bring you through your project, so you just have to find the one that you created. Which would be this Firebase login project right here. So I'm going to hit enter, and let's see what we have here. It wants me to initialize the Firestore database in order to add it to the project, which it only takes 2 seconds, but still, because that's not what this video is about, I'll just add it in the next video. But let's go back here and let's just add hosting this time. We'll use an existing project and we'll select the Firebase login project. Now where it says, what do you want to use as your public directory? We don't want to use public, we want to use dist, which you can see right up at the top here, top left corner. So we're going to change this from public to dist. Configure as a single page app, yes, of course, because that's what we've done here with history mode. Set up automatic builds and deploy it with GitHub. If you're doing a long-term or a project that's more serious than this, I would say yes, go ahead and set that up. But right now, this is a demonstration video, so I'm going to say no. Now it says dist/index.html already exists. Overwrite, we're going to say no, we don't want to overwrite it. And we're all done now. So we can go ahead and build it and deploy it again just to make sure everything's working. Let's do npm run build. And then Firebase deploy. It gives you a URL, so let's take a look at that URL. And here we go. I zoomed in by mistake. But if you look at this, we're actually at this weird name right here and then .web.app. So the one thing, and let me zoom out a little bit. The one thing that I have to say about this URL right here is I didn't change the name of the project before I created this, and that's why I have this crazy name up here. But if you register a domain name with Google Domains or Namecheap, whatever service you like, there's no problem at all updating this to a more clean domain name. But if I would have named this, for example, My Firebase App, this would say myfirebaseapp.web.app. but I didn't change the name of the app before creating this. So that's why we have this sort of cryptic looking thing right there. But now our hosting is live. Now we want to install Firebase, so we're going to do npm install Firebase -- save. Let that install. Anytime I see this warning right here, I always do npm audit fix. I should be able to just paste that in there. But don't ever force it. So there's this one with the force flag right there. Don't do that. That will more often than not break your app. But you can always do npm audit fix, and if there's something it can fix without breaking your app, it will. So now we have Firebase installed. What we're going to do now is we're going to create a Firebase folder. And just like how we have our router folder right here with index.js, and we have our store folder with index.js, that's the beauty of Webpack. The Vue CLI uses Webpack. So what I mean by that is we're going to create a folder called Firebase inside of our source folder. So we'll do new folder, we'll call it Firebase, and then new file, we'll call it firebase.js. I'm sorry, that's not what I meant to do. We're going to call it index.js, but we can just refer to it by the Firebase folder, and it will automatically import the index file into that because of Webpack. That's the beauty of standardization. Now what we want to put inside of this Firebase file right here, we want to do import Firebase from Firebase/app. We also want to import Firebase/auth, and that will give us access to the Firebase settings and the authentication methods and everything like that. Now what we want to do here is Firebase config. That's going to be an object, so we'll say const Firebase config equals, and now we have to go back to our Firebase dashboard to get that. Under project overview, we see it says one app, and then we can click on the cog and it'll bring us to the settings. From here, if you want, you can give it a better public facing name, you can change the project name, and what I'm going to do is scroll down to config, and we're going to copy this. So if we go back here, we can just overwrite that, and now we have our credentials here. These credentials, it's okay for this to be open to the world. This isn't something that someone else can use to manipulate your account with, so don't stress about that. But again, it's one of those things that's probably better off, even though there's nothing wrong with it, you're probably better off having it not just publicly available. But what I am saying is that you don't have to throw that into your environment variables or anything like that. The next thing that we want to do is we want to do Firebase.initializeApp, and now we get the IntelliSense, which is wonderful. And then we want to throw the Firebase config in there. And that will configure our Firebase app. Now we want to do export const auth. And that's going to be Firebase.auth. So now we have this auth object right here, and we can import that into our app. Now I just changed the view back to right here where we have it running. So I'm going to move this a little bit so you can see better. And we're going to go back to our login page right here. Now we want to import that auth object into this login page, this login component. So we'll do import auth, and that needs to be inside of curly braces because we're exporting it directly from Firebase. And that should be sufficient because it's index.js inside of there. But just like we have to register components, we also have to register this auth object. But we do that directly in data. So we'll paste that in. We don't have to give it any sort of value. We'll just put the comma after it, and we should be good with it now. Let's actually do this to test if it worked. Let's do console log auth. And now if we go to our web page, and I'm referring specifically to our local version, if I open up the dev tools here and refresh the page, we have our auth object right there. So we can validate that yes, it's able to access Firebase, and our auth object is ready to be used. Now back to our login.view, we want to make sure that login and sign up, these are both going to be async. So that's asynchronous. We're going to have to wait on information back from Firebase. And this is actually incredibly simple. So for login, let's do this. We'll do await auth dot, this is login. So we're going to do sign in with email and password. Auth dot sign in with email and password. And then we're going to pass in the email and the password. And it should be just that simple. Now with the sign up, we're going to do the same thing, except instead of being sign in with email and password, that's going to be create user with email and password. There we go. It knew exactly what I was trying to do because the IntelliSense is wonderful. I'll comment out these alerts here, and let's add an error message in here. So we'll say error, set that to null, and then where can we display that error message? Maybe right underneath the H2. Yeah, we should be able to do that. Now we can wrap this in a try catch block. So we'll try that, and then we'll catch. And let's do that right here too. So if there's an error, we're going to catch the error. And we'll say this.error equals error.message, I believe. I'll double check that. But we'll put that right here as well. So now we'll be notified what the error is if we have an error. Just to be safe, we're also gonna wrap this in, let's make it a p tag. And we're only gonna show it, so we'll say vif equals error, so that we won't get any sort of error because there's no error for it to render. So one more alert that we still have here is this authenticate alert. So let's get rid of that. And after they sign in with the username or the password, we're going to add a .then block. And it's going to return a user credential. So we're going to do the ES6 sort of standard format here. So we'll do user credential. And then this is where Vuex is going to come into play. But first, we just want to make sure it works. So let's console log user credential.user. And we can do this exact same thing right here. Now we'll test those out and see if they work. Let's also comment out where we logged the auth object right there because we don't need that anymore. And let's see if it works. We go back to our local app and we're gonna switch this to sign up. For the email, I'm gonna do firebase@mailinator.com. If you don't know, Mailinator is a public mailbox where anybody can access it. So I'm doing this so that I can access it if I need to authenticate. For the password, I'm just going to do password at 2021. And let's do it again. And let's do sign up. And I'll check the log. Okay, we got an error here. This error is actually coming from the fact that I didn't turn on the authentication on Firebase. So if I go to Firebase, we go to authentication, I need to actually activate this first. We're doing email and password. And for the record, this is where you would set up any other type of authentication, any of the OAuth or the service-based authentications or anonymous authentications, and then you can specify where people are allowed to connect from. You can see that localhost is on there right now. So we're going to go to template and password. We're going to do edit configuration. Let's turn it on. And we're not going to do the passwordless sign in, but that is how you do it. I'm sure you're all familiar with what that means. It would be the magic link, as Slack calls it. It requires a little bit more setup than this. So let's try that again now. We'll go back to our web app, the local version. I'm going to do a hard refresh, sign up. We'll do Firebase at Mailinator. And let's try to sign up. We'll give it a second, and let's see, we have something here now. If we expand it, it's awfully long, it looks complicated, but let's click on email. We see the email address there. The email address is not verified, so let's keep that in mind. We also have the user ID, the UID, unique ID. So let's take a look at Firebase now. If we go to our Firebase interface here, and then we go to authentication, users, we now have it right there. I'm actually going to go to Mailinator, and it should ask for me to validate the email address. So the reason it didn't send anything to the public mailbox here is because I didn't use the option to send an email validation link. But we now have the username, we have a username and password that we can work with. So now let's start modifying our state management. So what we want to do after someone logs in is we want to set the user object, the same user object that we just looked at right here. We want to set that to the user object in Vuex, but we only want a few things from it. So let's see what it has. We want email and UID. Maybe we also want email verified. So email verified, and UID. So again, we want email verified, and UID. So we're pulling these out with object destructuring from this user credential.user. So I'll just copy and paste that. I'll comment this out. Now, if we take a look at the store, we have an action called set user. So to reference that, what we're going to do is we're going to say this dot and then store with the $ in front of it dot dispatch, because we're dispatching an action. And then the action that we're dispatching is set user. So that's going to be a string called set user. And then we're going to add a comma. Then we're going to add in what we want to set the user to. So we want to set the user to an object that has the email verified, and UID. So very simply, this is what it's going to look like. And we're going to copy and paste this right down here as well. So whether they're signing in for the first time or whether it's a recurring sign in, now we're going to update the state. Now, in case you don't remember, on the app.view page, the the main view, the first view where everything starts, we have this user object, and what we're doing is we're calling the getter and returning the current user, which by default is set to null. So let's go ahead and try logging in and see what happens now. I've opened up the Vue DevTools and I selected the Vuex tab right here. So for some reason, I'm on the beta version right now. Some reason I noticed it doesn't always work. So if it doesn't work, we'll look at it a different way. But the email address we used was firebase@mailinator.com. And then the password that I used was password@1. And if we log in, we see right up at the top here, we've got the email address, the email verified, and then the UID. So this set our state management exactly how we wanted it. And of course the DevTools seem to, it actually looks like they're working just fine. So now if we take a look at state, we see that there's a user object with these items in there, and there's a getter with current user as an object, again, the same 3 items. So this is where it starts getting really cool. If we go back to Vuex, what we can do here is we can add another getter, and let's call it current user logged in. Now, of course, we need to give it access to the state, and it will return state.user. Let's put a question mark after it, because if the user isn't authenticated, we don't want it to error out. So state.user question mark dot, and then let's call the UID. And what we're returning is we want to know if that UID exists, because that's what we're going to reference in our Firestore rules when we're working with Firestore. We're going to see if the person making the request for the database has a user ID or a unique ID. So we're just going to say not null, just like that. And now we have this new item right here, current user logged in, without having to create any mutation or action. It's just a different view of this user object right there. Now if we go back to app.view and we have this user object right here, let's change this. So instead of store.getters.getCurrentUser, let's call current user logged in. So let's paste that in there instead. And now let's take a look at our app. The current user isn't logged in because the hot reload module has reset it. So let's log in again. And when we log in, it gets switched to true. If we take a look at the DevTools, now we can see that we have current user, which is an object, but we also have current user logged in set to true now. So let's change the name of this right here from user to user logged in. And we will actually just comment that out because we don't need to see that every time. But let's copy this because we're going to use it somewhere else. If we go to this other view that we created, the status view, let's paste it in there. So we're going to create a method, and then we're going to, computed, not method. And we'll paste it in right there. And just once again to verify, let's do this. We'll say user logged in. Take a look at our status. And we can see that the user logged in is still set to true. We still have all the user object information right here. And so now that it says true here, let's change how this works. We'll have it say you are not logged in if it says false. So user logged in. If true, you are logged in. If it's false, you are not logged in. So now we have the status page. You are logged in. And might as well let's add an emoji to that just for good measure. So we have a check mark if they're logged in, or we have the worried face if they're not logged in. And the one last thing that we really need to do in this particular instance, on the login page, we want it to automatically change to the status page after the person logs in. So let's go back to where we're setting the credential. And right here, again, what we're going to want to do is we'll say route. What we want to do is we want to call the router and we want to push it to a different view. So if we look at the router again to refresh our memories, we have a view called status. So we can call that by saying the same way that we called the store. If we look at our main, where is it here? Main.js, we have router and we have store in here. That means that we can call the router the same way that we called the store. So we'll say this.router.push status. And we're going to paste that also down in here. So after logging in, it should push you to the status page. One last thing that we need to do, and then we should be done here. On this login page right here, if the user is logged in, then we want to give them a button to let them log out. So let's change this. Let's add a directive here. So we have this section with the class of form, and let's say the if, and then I forget, do we have the user referenced from Vuex on here? We don't, so let's add it. We'll say user logged in, return this dot store, again with the $sign before it, dot getters dot, and then I forget what we named that, so let's double check, current user logged in. So user logged in can be referenced now on this page. So we'll say if current user logged in, and we'll set that to false. So if the current user is not logged in, show them the login form. And then we'll add a else. So we'll make another section section area. We'll say else. And then we'll copy the button, although we have to change a few things about it. We don't want it to be disabled. We'll give it the same class. And when we click, we don't want it to authenticate, we want it to log out. And then we just want this to say log out. Now we need to create a logout method. And with Firebase, this is incredibly easy. All it has to do is call this auth object, just like we did right here. We're going to say auth.signout. And that's built right into the Firebase auth object. Then we'll do .then, and we'll add an ES6 anonymous function in there. And we can add a catch object on there, but I can't really imagine we'll have any sort of error while trying to log out. But it probably still is best practices. But what do we want to happen when the person signs out? We want to call this.store.dispatch set user, and we want the user to be set to null, which will also update the getter, which sets whether or not they're logged in. So let's try this and see if it works, because I think we've done quite a bit here. Let's also center this logout button. So we'll give this section a class called logout, and then down here we'll copy the form class, and we'll get rid of the border and the border radius and the padding. Call this logout. And then let's maybe give this a more reddish type of color. So we'll change this from primary to danger, or warning rather. And let's set it to orange red. Probably need to make the color black for that to look good, the text color. And then we'll set that button to a class of warning. And that should be better. Okay, not crazy about that color. It's not too great on the eyes. Let's make this pink maybe. Okay, that's more manageable. All right, so let's check the status. You're logged in. Let's try logging out. There we go. So that did work. Let's try logging in again. Log in. You are logged in. So everything is working beautifully here. Now we have access to Firebase, we have access to Firestore with just a couple more lines of code, and we have a full authentication system here with routing, state management, everything that you need for any app that you can really imagine. So I'm going to put this up on GitHub. I'll put a link to it down below in case you want to reference it or follow along, and then I'll create a video in the very near future about how to add Firestore so that you have a NoSQL database that you can add, and we'll give this some sort of other interesting functionality. After that, we'll get into some stuff with React. That should be a lot of fun too. If you have any questions, recommendations, anything like that, comment down below and let me know. Let me know if you want to see more of these types of videos. I personally enjoy doing them, and I wish you the best of luck if you're just getting into this.